We're going to learn how to build a simple JavaFX application based on FXML. And for this, we're going to create a new JavaFX application in the new project dialog. We're going to go ahead and call this JavaFX FXML because this is FXML-based JavaFX application. And then before we get going, we need to configure this project so that it works. So the assumption here is that you've already downloaded and it's extracted the JavaFX library from Gluon. So in this case, we're going to go into the project structure. And inside the project structure, we're going to navigate to libraries, click the small plus up here, and click on Java. And here we're going to provide the path to our lib folder in the JavaFX library folder where you extracted it to. And once we've done that, it'll ask us if we want to add the reference to this library to the current project, and we would like to, of course. Then we need to go up here and do a final thing. We need to go into Run and Edit Configurations, and here in VM Options we need to add the following. Now this is the default string that you are presented with from the JetBrains tutorial on creating a new JavaFX application. The path to FX part here assumes that you have an environment variable that points to the lib folder that we had before. And in case you haven't configured that, which I haven't, you need to replace this part here with a path to the lib folder also. So we're going to go ahead, click apply here and click OK. And just to validate that things are working, we're going to navigate into our source folder and run the main class. Now if everything is working as it should, what you should see is this small program window here, and this is the appearance of our example application as it is. Now we're going to dive into each of the three files that we're presented with here. There are two classes, and then there's this FXML file. So if we start out in the FXML file, this is the part where you have the visual elements of your GUI defined. This is not Java code. Instead, what this is FXML, which is a notation based on XML or extensible markup language that you can use if you want to define hierarchical things such as a graphical user interface, or more specifically a scene graph in the context of JavaFX. So in here we have all the visual elements. As you can see right now, the only thing that we have is a grid pane and then some imports up here. The import is the same thing as imports in Java basically. It tells the FXML document which components we want to use. So the grid pane is just a layout pane. It doesn't contain anything. It is used to organize content. So this is why our application appears to be somewhat empty currently. Now, one of the things that we'll notice here is that on our grid pane we have an attribute. So the things that you see here are attributes. And one of these attributes is called FX controller. And this is the fully qualified name of a class that contains the control logic for our application. So, for instance, once you click a button, the code that is going to be executed is being placed in this Java class up here. Now, fortunately, this is the exact class that we see up here, sample controller. And if we go in here, we can see that as it is, this is just an empty class. This is because we haven't defined any handlers for any controls, since we don't have any controls currently. But once we start adding buttons and so on, and we want stuff to happen in our GUI once we click a button, this is where we define the code that make that happen. We'll get back to that in a bit. The last thing that I'll take you through is the main class. The main class in a JavaFX application always extends this application class, which is part of the JavaFX library. So once we extend that, we're required to override the start method. In the start method, we define the root of our scene graph. It is also here that we would define the entire scene graph if we were using a Java-based JavaFX application, but in this case, the scene graph itself is defined in the FXML document. So this is also where the root is loaded from. So it goes ahead and calls this FXML loader class and a static load method in that class in order to fetch the contents of our FXML document and translate that into Java code. So down here we see that we have a stage, and this stage is the stage that is passed to our start method here. We haven't created that. This is done by JavaFX entirely, but we're able to configure it, for instance, by adding a new title to it. We also are able to add a scene. So the scene is the contents that we would like to have displayed in our main window. In this case, we are creating a new scene window, and the scene window, or the scene object that we are creating, is passed the reference to the root of our scene graph, and it is also passed some dimensions in order to dimension it to the size that we would like to have it. For the time being, we'll just leave it as it is. Down here we call the show method on the stage object, and this is important. This is what actually displays our window. If we forget that, nothing is displayed and our application seems to not be running. So we need to remember that. We also have a public static void main method, which is what we're used to have, and of course which is required in order to execute this class. And we see it here that it calls some static method launch that must be somewhere in application and passes on the args. We'll leave that for now, but just know that the launch down here is necessary for your JavaFX application to run as intended. So now we're going to go ahead and we're going to do something to our GUI. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to change the layout to a different type of layout class. So I'm going to use the VBox. The VBox is a very simple layout. It organizes the controls by lining them up vertically along a line, and it's very easy to work with, which is why we're going to use it in this tutorial here. Then we're going to go ahead and add some controls, some visual elements to our GUI. The first visual element that we are going to add is a label. A label is just a control for containing text, and we need to define a attribute on this label called FXID if we want to be able to manipulate this label from the Java code in our controller later on. So I have a naming scheme where all my labels start out with LBL and then the name of this label, and we are going to call this LBL input. We're going to add something to its text attribute as well, and this will be input, and we'll see shortly why. And then actually I think we're going to leave the rest out for now. So I'll just terminate the the bracket here, the square bracket, and then it'll add another tag, because in XML you need to have this closing tag for each tag you have. So now we've added a label. The next thing that we're going to add is a text field. A text field, in contrary to a label, is not meant to display something to the user. It is meant to accept a user input that we are using for something behind the scenes. So we're going to add a text field. We're going to give this, and I need to import this as well. So the same rules apply here as in normal Java code. We need to import whatever types we're using. And we're going to provide this with an FXID as well. And for text fields, normally I name them txt and then the name of the text field. This helps me distinguish between the controls once I'm in my Java code, as we shall see later. The final thing that I'm going to add for now is a button. Now, since I'm not manipulating the button in the Java code later on, we'll just leave FXID out for now, but we are going to add a text attribute, which is where we put whatever we would like to have displayed on our button. Actually, we're also going to add another attribute, the onAction attribute, and we are going to define here something that looks a bit special. So we need to start out with a hashtag and then button on click. Now, button on click is in fact a method that this GUI will now expect to be in the controller. This is also why it's red currently, because as we could see before, our controller class is completely empty. So down here, it tells us that this method does not exist in the controller that you have up here. So of course we need to add that. Now luckily there's a shorthand for that. We can just Alt Enter on this method here and select the first method, create method button on click in controller. And we'll see that we're transferred into the controller class, and now it's added a method in here. Now, before we start programming this GUI or the behavior of this GUI in our controller, I think we'll go ahead and just run our program to see how our user interface looks now. So we see that we have our label up here with the input content. We see that we have an empty text field here, and we see that we have a button with the text click me. Now, of course, nothing happens currently because this method is empty. So this is completely as we would expect. Now, we need to do a few things in order to get hold of our controls. Now, we can use a special notation here where we type FXML, and then we can start getting hold of our controls from the GUI by using the right type, of course. We need to import the class as well, and we need to import the one from JavaFX, so remember that. And then we are going to use the same name here as we used in our XML document. So remember that our text field we call txt input. Once we've done that, now we're able to get a hold of the actual text field inside of our Java code. Now I can quickly demonstrate that by doing a system out print line statement here, and what we're going to print out is going to be text which is currently in our text field. So we're going to go ahead and type in txt input and then get text, which is the method that we'll invoke when we want to have the contents of a text field. So now we'll go ahead and run this and see that now hopefully we're able to get some user input and print it out in the console below. So I'm just going to type this is an input string and then click me. Now we would anticipate that our console down here is going to display this text up here if it works as intended. So let's go ahead and see what happens. And as we can see, this is working as intended. Now just for demonstration purpose, I'm going to add one final thing to this application before we finish this screencast. So I'm going to get a hold of our label as well. Now our label we called LBL input. And if you want to double check that, of course I need to import the label class first. If we want to double check that, we can just go ahead and check here that this was in fact the ID that I provided my label with. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to, just for the fun of it, call the setText method on label and then provide that with the value which is currently in my text field. So I'm going to get the txt input dot get text, and now what we would expect is once we click the button, this method is fired, and this is going to set the text on our label equal to the text that is currently in our text field. So let's go ahead and see if this works as we would expect. I'm going to type in the text label has changed. Then I'm going to click here and we see that now the label has indeed changed.